Eating sandwiches, 'cause they're all delicious. This might be a half now, half later type deal. Damn, this motherfucker really wrapped this shit up. Didn't cut it in half? Fucking. Teach this motherfucker how to cut a sandwich. Yo, fuck.
this, but on February 24, 2021, Fry's Electronics announced that they made the difficult decision to shut down their operations and close their business permanently. Even the way they word that makes it sound so sad and definite. There were so many people just emotionally affected by this news. They had a strong following considering their size. A few of them have closed even before this big announcement, but at their peak, they were only operating 34 locations, half of which were in California. So for the confused people watching this that maybe aren't even familiar with Fry's, let me try to explain what made them so special. To put it simple, they were like all the different kinds of electronic stores wrapped into one. They were like Best Buy or Circuit City in that they sold everyday electronics like TVs and stereo systems, but then they were also like Radio Shack in that they sold all the electronic components like resistors and capacitors, obviously to a much more narrow customer base. But possibly the thing that they were most famous for was their computer parts. In the past, they were compared to CompUSA, whereas today the best comparison would probably be Micro Center. So that is a pretty awesome store, right? They had the reputation of being a one-stop shop, having just about everything that you would possibly need when it came to electronics. In addition to all of these other cool aspects, it varied between locations, but they would commonly sell snacks and magazines and just make it a cool place to hang out for people who are interested in electronics. Oh, and they had all these elaborate themes. I don't even know where else you would see this. The one in Las Vegas was shaped like a giant slot machine. The one in Burbank had a giant UFO that crashed right into the front doors. They had actually hired someone who worked at Lucasfilm to design all of this stuff. It made them stand out, and it appears that the customers appreciated it. Now, maybe you think that this is an open and shut case. Retail stores have been struggling already, and then the pandemic came along and made everything worse. That is what most of the reports are saying, and that's almost exactly the reasons that they provided in their shutdown announcement. And I'm not saying that's wrong, it's just a little simplistic, and there's more to it. Fry's was struggling in an unusually weird way before 2020. Even their most dedicated of followers will tell you that over the last few years, Fry's has lost their magic. What used to be a fun experience has turned into a depressing one. Their selection had become so embarrassing that it was to a point where they actually had empty shelves all over the stores. Now, I should point out that this has always been a private company operated by the Fry family, and the Fry family has been notoriously secretive. It has proven difficult for me or anyone really to gain certain information, such as financial figures, but I do have some supported theories as to what happened that I think come together nicely to tell a story. And there's three major parts to it. The first one being poor customer service, which I know sounds like a common complaint, but I think that it was a big factor here. Here, let me back up for a second. Going all the way back to 1954, two brothers named Donald and Charles Fry opened a new store near San Francisco. It wasn't Fry's Electronics, it was a supermarket named Fry's Food Store. By the 1970s, that store had grown into a chain of more than 40 locations evenly split around San Francisco and Phoenix. At that time, there was another chain of supermarkets based in Kansas called Dillon's that was looking to expand by acquiring other regional supermarket chains, so they bought Fry's Food Stores for the price of $14 million. But the Fry family continued to be involved. Charles stayed on as a manager, and his son John even managed their computer systems after graduating with a math degree in 1978. Well, in 1982, all of Dillon's, including Fry's Food Stores, was sold to Kroger, and that's when the members of the Fry family ended their involvement. And Kroger has kept the brand alive to this day in Arizona, so oddly enough, there is a Fry supermarket chain there that stems from the Fry family, but for decades has had nothing to do with them. Okay, there's a lot here, but I promise we're getting there. When Charles Fry made that $14 million, it was reported that he gave $1 million of it to each of his three sons, including John, the one I had just mentioned. Given his degree in math, experience working with computers, and knowledge of the supermarket business, he thought it would be logical to open somewhat of an electronic supermarket. He then convinced his two brothers, Randy and David, to invest their $1 million into the business, and in 1985, finally, they opened the first Fry's Electronics. It was located in Sunnyvale, California, right in the center of Silicon Valley, an area populated with some of the most tech-savvy people in the country. Their plan from the very beginning was to attract these intelligent industry professionals, people who knew a lot about computers. They were able to do it by creating the right atmosphere, even selling food and integrating other supermarket aspects, but mostly it was the low prices and a wide selection. Early on, they were pricing things so low that they were losing money, but they felt that it was worth it to build that customer base. Now, this is where the customer service comes in. If most of your customers are practically computer geniuses, do you know how much money you would have to pay to hire someone even more qualified than they are? Plus, given that the customers were so knowledgeable, they never really needed much help anyway. For those reasons, it just made sense for them to make that sacrifice to hire less qualified people at a lower price and put those savings into the decorations or better selections or whatever else was more important to that very specific customer base. In fact, they became widely known for having bad customer service, especially when it came to returns. They were paying their employees bonuses if they were able to convince the customer to accept store credit instead of cash, which, is not a pleasant experience for the customer. In 1988, they opened their second store in Fremont, and 2 years later, they opened their third one in Palo Alto. That's all around the same area, and it wasn't until 1997 when they made a big push outside of California. It was that year that they purchased a similar chain of stores called Incredible Universe from Radio Shack, acquiring 6 new locations in Arizona, Texas, and Oregon, and converting them into Fry's. But obviously, those areas don't have as high of a population of tech enthusiasts, so I would imagine that's when the customer service became more of an issue. Going off of that, another part of this would be their lack of locations. I'm thinking that a good comparison to make here would be with IKEA. They only have around 50 US locations, but they're big in area and provide a unique experience that has gained some strong followers that are willing to take a long trip just to get there. I'm guessing that many of the people watching this have driven for over an hour to get to IKEA, and I would also guess that many of the tech enthusiasts watching this have done the same thing with Fry's. What I'm saying here is for both of them, an unusually high percentage of their sales must have come from people who live far away from the stores. Back when Fry's was expanding, when picking new locations, they would actively seek out cheaper, more obscure areas because they knew people were willing to come to them. Well, the reason the entire system started to break down is the third part of it, the internet. Probably the biggest single reason behind their failure, because there are many parts to this. First off, one of the biggest ways that they competed, as I said, was through selection. It was something that made them different from the other stores, but now with internet retailers like Newegg and even Amazon, there are more convenient ways to access a wide selection. It was a big issue when it came to Radio Shack and other specialty stores, but potentially even more so for Fry's, because as I said, they were counting on people driving long distances to get there. They tried offering this price matching thing, but I don't think it helped much because the issue was more in convenience rather than pricing. It has always been inconvenient. It's just that today there are not many people willing to drive an hour to get something that's easy enough to order from their home at the same price. And really, possibly one of the biggest advantages that physical retailers have over the internet ones is the human interaction and the customer service. Something that Fry's has sacrificed from the very beginning. So, do you see how they've been especially impacted by the internet? I don't want to keep piling onto this, but they could have been one of those internet retailers, but they were not on top of it. I mean, you would think that their customer base would have been some of the first people buying things on the internet, so the opportunity was there. Sadly, they ignored it altogether until 2001 when they made a few attempts at buying some failing retailers like Egghead, but ultimately ended up purchasing Outpost.com in a $21 million deal. But even that was far too little too late. They had branding issues and that people didn't even realize Outpost.com was connected to Fry's, and it took them 5 more years before they simply called it Fry's.com. Again, I wish I had figures to support it and better tell the story, but here's where I'm guessing things went from there. Fry's continued to be a cool destination to hang out for anyone who loved computers and electronics, but their reasons to go there became more personal and less practical. What I mean there is if someone needed a specific computer part, they could find it online, or they could use it as an excuse to take a ride down to Fry's. But because they did lose that practical portion of their business, their sales were likely going down. I have to think that it became difficult for them to continue selling such a wide selection and supporting the lower profits that are associated with such a variety and in maintaining such a large building. So the product selections became more and more limited and people no longer had that excuse to go there. Eventually they switched to a consignment model for their inventory, which is not traditional. Basically, instead of buying their inventory from the suppliers and reselling it to their customers, they would obtain the inventory without actually buying it yet, and the suppliers would only get paid after it's sold to the customer. It likely meant that they weren't able to pay their suppliers in the traditional ways. So then, the store that was once known for having the best selection now had the worst selection. The shelves were mostly empty or filled with undesirable items because everything that they sold was only coming from companies willing to agree to these untraditional, usually less favorable sales terms. That's getting pretty deep, but in general, the fun store that sold practically everything slowly transformed into a depressing store that sold almost nothing. And by the way, all of this was before the pandemic, so maybe you could say that was a final nail in the coffin type thing, but I don't believe it was among their biggest issues. Let me know in the comments, what has been your experience with Fry's Electronics? I realize that many of you just learned about them recently, but for anyone who has been there and has watched the changes over the years, what do you have to say about it? Did you expect it to happen, or were you surprised? Obviously, toward the end, it was expected, but I mean early on. And do you agree with the reasons that I outlined? Or do you think there's more to it? Maybe something to do with the Fry family personally? As I keep saying, it is a very private company, so there is a degree of speculation. So any other theories or overall thoughts about Fry's Electronics, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.
I am fat. I am fat.
Everyone seen Best Buy's new logo?
I'm so fat.
They changed it a few months ago. The text has changed from black to white. The yellow price tag is still part of it, but in a smaller way and down there in the corner. I like it, but this is a big change. That old logo was so iconic. It's been there since the late 80s, which is my entire life, so it may take some time to get used to it, but I think it's fitting. Best Buy itself has changed so much over the past few years, maybe it's time for a new logo as well. Best Buy started out small, as one location in St. Paul, Minnesota, with 7 or 8 employees. This is the guy who started it, Richard Scholes. In 1966, he remortgaged his house to get some capital that he used to open that store. It specialized in stereos and was called Sound of Music. Now, when I hear the phrase Sound of Music, I think of the Best Picture winning musical, which turns out was released in 1965, the year before he opened the store, so I heavily suspect he took influence from it. Now, in the first year of business, sales reached $173,000, and it just grew steadily from there. Over the next 15 years or so, it built up to a handful of locations around the Minnesota area. But in the early 80s, some changes were made that helped bring them to that next level. In 1982, the decision was made to expand their product offerings from just speakers and audio equipment. They would now offer appliances and other electronics, such as VCRs. It was all a big hit, and sales grew to $9.3 million at this point. The next year, they changed the name to Best Buy. The year after that, they introduced these superstores, and again, it was all a big hit. In those 3 years, they transformed the business into the one that we know today. Within 5 years, their sales grew from that 9.3 million into 239 million. I think from this point, we can say that they were up and running, to a point where in the 1990s, the only 2 stores of this kind even worth mentioning were Best Buy and Circuit City. By 1992, Best Buy sales were up to 929 million, and then the next year they were up to 1.6 billion. The two were in direct competition with each other. I'll cover it all in more detail in the future when I make a video about Circuit City, but I think we all know how the battle ended. I guess Best Buy won, because in 2009, Circuit City filed for bankruptcy and closed all of their stores. At first glance, you would think that this is fantastic news for Best Buy. Historically, their largest and most direct competitor was now gone. A perfect opportunity to take advantage and scoop up their market share. Do you remember that game Slither.io, or whatever it's called? When one of the other snakes died, you would eat up all those glowing dots that they left behind and then become bigger? I think you know what I'm saying here, but that's not really what happened. It turns out that the entire industry was having troubles. I think a more accurate metaphor would be the giant snake coming by and terrorizing all of them. The little snakes being Best Buy, Circuit City, we can put Radio Shack in that group as well. You're probably already thinking it, but the big snake would represent Amazon and the other online retailers. Now, obviously, this is a very simplified summary of the situation, to a point where it's almost ridiculous, but that is what was happening. Circuit City and Radio Shack didn't really make it through it, or were at least tremendously harmed by it. And around 2012, 2013, it was looking like things were going to go the same way for Best Buy. Let me show you just how bad things were looking. I like this one. It's a popular article from Forbes from 2012 called Why Best Buy is Going Out of Business Gradually. Right in the beginning, Electronics retailer Best Buy is headed for the exits. I can't say when exactly, but my guess is that it's only a matter of time, maybe a few more years. Then it's sort of what I was saying. It says, consider a few key metrics. Despite the disappearance of competitors, including Circuit City, the company is losing market share. I'd say this was a very fair assessment at the time. This article's from 2012, and I would say at 2012, 2013, they were at their lowest. Here's what I'm trying to illustrate. Overall, things went very well for Best Buy from the early 80s up until around 2009. From 2009 till maybe 2013, they were losing it. Then from 2013 until today, they brought it back. Now, it's nice when I can pull up their sales graph and it tells that exact story, but it's not the case here. And that does show how these top line sales don't mean everything. If you were to just go by this, you'd say their best year was 2012 and they've been falling ever since. Let me show you a more applicable graph. Comparable store sales. This is basically a comparison of how each store sold in comparison to the previous year. So in 2009, on average, each store sold 1.3% less than it did the year before. You definitely want to see positive numbers here, and I can tell you the 10 years before this range were all positive. Their first negative year was in 2009, and 4 of the next 5 were negative as well, followed by 4 straight positive years once again, 2018 being the best one. Now, I say this perfectly illustrates a rise, a fall, and a rise again. I should also mention that their only 2 years of negative income occurred in 2012 and 2013, and then their stock price was struggling. I think I've proven that this was a bad time for Best Buy. I mean, you probably knew it already, but they brought it back. Their stock price right now is hitting all-time highs. Like I already showed, same store sales are up, there's positive income, Moody's just improved their credit rating. If you look at their earning reports or their balance sheet, almost everything is looking pretty good. Let me talk about how they did it. Best Buy in general is smaller today than it was 5 years ago. They have fewer stores in the US, plus on average their stores are smaller, but where they've really shrunk is internationally. For the international viewers, in the UK, if you're familiar with Carphone Warehouse, they used to own half of it, but they've since sold it. The same goes for Phone House throughout the rest of Europe. In Canada, they used to own Future Shop, and they've either closed them or converted them into Best Buys. Still a much smaller Canadian presence overall. In China, Five Star Appliance Company, they used to own the majority stake, but have since sold it. In Mexico, well, actually, Mexico is the only place they've grown since 2013, but not by much. They've clearly increased their emphasis on the North American markets, specifically the United States, while decreasing their size in general. And this is all a huge part of why their revenue graph looks the way it does. The second way they're doing better is they found ways to separate themselves from Amazon and the other online retailers. Are you familiar with the term showrooming? It's the practice of visiting a store or stores in order to examine a product before buying it online at a lower price. I've done it. You go down to Best Buy to look at a new phone or computer, then go home and buy it online from a different company. What a terrible thing for Best Buy, and a great thing for Amazon. Best Buy is covering all the costs that are involved for you to look at a product, employees and floor space and everything else, and Amazon is making the sale. Best Buy is spending money so their competitor can sell more stuff. That was maybe their biggest issue 5 years ago, and they needed to address it fast. Here's how they did it. They brought in a new CEO who, to many, seemed like an odd choice. He wasn't really experienced in electronics, but rather his background was in hospitality and travel. He used to be the CEO of a travel company. To put it simple, he was more concerned with the customer experience than anything else. This is when they started a turnaround plan, labeled Renew Blue. The plan was centered around cutting their expenses and strengthening their services.
It was a lot about fixing what was broken. So we ensured that we were price competitive, We improved the customer experience.
They managed to cut billions in cost, and this allowed them to lower their prices. Price matching was a smart move. If they can match that Amazon price, why would you go home to buy it from them when you could just buy it there? It's easier. But on top of that, Best Buy does have a huge advantage over Amazon in terms of convenience. Just think of the little things. Maybe the charging cable for your phone stops working. You don't want to wait for Amazon to ship it to you. You want it as soon as possible. By making their prices comparable, they've made themselves an attractive option in that situation. As far as strengthening their customer service, that involved making sure that their in-store staff is knowledgeable about the products that they're selling, because that's more important now than ever before. Along these same lines, strengthening services like Geek Squad. A quick personal story here. I had an issue with my computer about a week ago, and I didn't know what to do, so I brought it to Best Buy. The guy from the Geek Squad fixed it in about 5 minutes and didn't charge me anything, including the trip. The whole thing took 30 minutes, and it gave me a great idea for a video topic. Their new customer service focus also involves following up after the sale is made, offering services where they'll install your fancy high-tech doorbell or mount your TV. As of last year, their Renew Blue plan has concluded, and they've marked the end of their turnaround phase, and now have entered a growth phase that they've labeled Best Buy 2020, Building the New Blue. The emphasis here seems to be on doubling down on their services and building customer relationships, specifically when it comes to smart homes. They view a large potential in that market and hope to capture a good percentage of it. This includes their in-home advisor program, where essentially for free they'll have an expert come out to your home and tell you how they can help you with your electronics or smart home needs. There's more that can be said about the turnaround. The whole store within a store concept was a big part of it. It builds relationships with the other companies and gets people in their store, which is always a good thing. There's also their increased emphasis on online sales, but I feel that one's more obvious. Let me summarize. Amazon and the internet changed the market, and they contributed to the failures of Circuit City and Radio Shack and almost Best Buy, but they reacted to it. They saw a few years that were less than impressive, and it motivated them to make big changes. They shrunk in size, they put more emphasis on American operations, while bringing in a new CEO that put emphasis on cutting costs and customer interactions, along with many other changes that all have seemed to work. They've implemented a successful turnaround plan and are now focused on growth. Let me know in the comments, where do you stand on all of this? Do you agree with the reasoning I provided for their comeback, or do you think there's more to the story that I failed to mention? And do you think the comeback will last? Do they have a stable future ahead, or not? Also, what do you think of the new logo? Is it indeed a fitting change to go along with a changing company? I'd like to hear what you have to say.
I'm about to restart.
Thank you for watching.